So this is kind of a follow-up to my previous video, which went through who should and who shouldn't buy an old Defender, just as a warning to those on thinking of buying one. It may not be what you expect it to be. So if you want, go back and watch that video first and then come back to this one. Now, if you happen to be amongst the lucky or amongst the idiots who enjoy old cars like this one, then I would like to give you some advice of what to look out for when going out and buying an old Defender, or perhaps an old Discovery, or even a Range Rover Classic. All three cars are on the same chassis, the same axles, and mostly the same engines. The Range Rovers and the Discoveries had the V8s as well, the Defenders not so much, but most of them have the same engines and the same chassis. The Defender, the later ones, had the TD5 and the Ford Puma engines. I have worked on many Defenders, and of course I have taken this thing apart more times than I can remember now. So I do know my way around these cars, and I do know the problems. Now, the first and by far the most important thing to look out on a Defender, especially if you are in the UK or in the US and looking at a Defender that has been imported from the UK, is rust. Rust is the killer of all cars, and especially cars like the Defender, which depend on their chassis. I want to mention this once again. If you are in the US and looking to buy a Defender, Defenders over there are very expensive, and there are a lot of them that have been imported from the UK. They are rusted apart and they need complete restorations from the chassis and upwards. Everything needs to be changed. And if you pay upwards of $20,000 for a car like that, then you will be in a bad situation. So be very careful. Also be very careful of leaf sprung vehicles that are advertised as Defenders. Those aren't Defenders, they are Santana vehicles, and I have seen those on Marketplace in the US being advertised as Defenders. They aren't Defenders, and they certainly do not have the same value as Defenders. So be very careful when buying an old Land Rover in the US. Now, back to the main issues. The chassis on the old Defenders tends to rot, not because it isn't a good chassis, but because it is now very old, and in climates like England, where the roads are filled with salt and grit, the chassis tend to rot away. This is the case for all old cars, and it is also the case for the Defender. The most common places for these chassis to rot is the rear end, the rear crossmember, and the rear legs of the chassis that lead up to the crossmember. That is the area that gets all of the spray from the tires, and the mud and grit sits right there and rots the chassis away. You will also find holes in the front area of the chassis and in the middle as well, but for the most part, the worst rust will be found in the rear. One more thing to keep in mind is that the rear section might have been repaired, and what I mean by repaired is that people chop the rear crossmember off and they weld a new one back on. There is nothing wrong with that if it's done correctly. If it hasn't been done correctly, then you might have a car that looks weird because it looks like it's bent, because the whole chassis is out of balance and out of shape. So be very careful of cars that have been repaired. If the Defender you are looking at is full of underseal underneath, be very suspicious, because underseal might be covering a lot of rust. Now, aside from the chassis, the body on the old Defender rots away. The wings, the floors, inside the doors, so the door frames tend to rot away, and you won't see that in many cases. The door hinges, the front bulkhead, so if you see rust right on top of the bonnet, underneath or above the little flaps under the windshield, then walk away from the car, because it will need a new bulkhead, and that is a very big job. Unless of course you are planning on fully restoring the car, then go ahead and buy it if the price of it reflects the rust that is on it. So in simple words, when you're buying an old Defender, especially in a wet and cold country, go over it very carefully, poke around for any rust holes and check every single panel, because rust can hide away in the small areas and rust is expensive to fix and it can easily ride away a car. So if the Defender you're looking at has no rust, then you are at a very good spot, because everything else on a Land Rover can be easily fixed. The next thing to do is obviously drive the car, listen for any clunks. Old Land Rovers tend to clank a lot. Mine clanks like crazy. I think it is the most clunky Land Rover I have ever heard, but it still goes nicely. So a bit of clanking isn't a problem, and very pronounced clunks might be indicators of worn diffs, a worn transfer case, or maybe even a worn transmission. Check that it stays into gear, especially second gear if it is a 300 TDI or a TD5. Check that it doesn't whine. Some of them do whine a bit. Some whining isn't always a problem, but if it whines like crazy, then this can be an indicator of worn bearings in the transmission, diffs, or the transfer case. It is also a good idea to walk around the car, check all 4 tires, check that they are in good condition and they are of the same brand. Mismatched, worn tires are often an indicator of an owner who didn't really care about the car and didn't want to spend much money on the car. So if they were trying to save money on the tires, they were probably also trying to save money on the mechanical bits. Of course, also have a look at the body, at the panel gaps. Keep in mind that it is a Land Rover, so the panel gaps are going to be big, but make sure that they are even throughout the whole car. They might be big, but they shouldn't be much bigger on one side than they are on the other side. This might indicate that the car has been in a crash. Check the front chassis legs for any signs of accident damage, and the same is also true for the rear chassis legs. Inside the engine bay, you should pretty much check what you would check on any car. Check that the head isn't cracked, the head gasket is okay, and the way you check this is by looking for pressure inside the cooling system or bubbles coming out of the cooling system. Check the condition of the oil and check the condition of the coolant. If the coolant is full of rust and looks old, then this is also a good indicator that the car hasn't been looked after. Oil leaks here and there are normal on an old Land Rover, so don't let those put you off unless there is a huge puddle underneath the car, or if the whole chassis is covered in oil, then there is something excessive going on. But a few drips here and there are fine. If you manage to find a Land Rover that doesn't leak, well done. You have found either a very good one or one that doesn't have any oil in it. So make sure that the latter isn't the case. If it has modifications, check that they have been done correctly and they are good quality parts. If the car has been painted, ensure it isn't hiding any nasty surprises like big dents, rust, a lot of body filler. For example, it might have been in an accident and someone might have used a lot of body filler to straighten the panels out, and then they just painted the whole thing over to make it look good and to hopefully find a buyer that won't realize this. All Defenders also tend to get stolen a lot, so check the numbers, make sure that everything matches and the car you're buying hasn't been stolen. You can also do a history check through various apps depending on where you live. Inside the Defender, there isn't much to worry about. They basically have 2 or 3 seats, a dashboard, and in most cases manual windows. If it is a Puma with the newer dashboard, check that that is in good condition and the general interior things like the seats and that all the buttons and controls work. The Puma Defenders usually have issues with their transmissions and the engines are a bit more complicated, so you might want to give those a bit more of a thorough check, because if they do go wrong, they are also more expensive to fix. After you have completed your checks, you're pretty much good to go. Don't expect to find a car that is perfect unless you are paying huge amounts of money. These are old vehicles now. Most of them were used as work vehicles, so they will have a few marks on them here and there. But that being said, they are very simple cars, they're very mechanical cars, so pretty much everything on them can be fixed if you have the money. If you have any further questions regarding buying an old Defender or an old Land Rover, leave them in the comments down below. I wish you good luck and a lot of strength to go along with your future Land Rover ownership. Thank you for watching and I'll see you on the next one.